white supremacy, because it's been such a part of American history, it has, of course, seeped into the feminist movement as well. The individual careerist rises of these white women have, in most cases, happened at the expense of women of color. They are going to have to pay the price of feminism being delegitimized because it was sent over on American bombs. We need to take vocabularies of resistance and revolution back from the powerful.
Welcome to episode 79 of the Refuse Fascism podcast. This podcast is brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in this country. Today, we're airing a wide-ranging conversation I had earlier this week with Rafia Zakaria, author of Against White Feminism. We touched on abortion, Afghanistan, empire and individualism, and white supremacy. We spoke about what kind of unity and resistance is needed now and how we get there. I'm very excited to share this with you. But first, I want to salute everyone who took to the streets this weekend to demand abortion rights. I was out in the streets, as you might hear in my voice, and I told the folks I was with at the Philly March, and I think it's worth saying it again here. It is important what we did yesterday, but this cannot be a one-off march, followed by just going back to our normal lives, or by taking the acts of writing postcards to senators and congresspeople, making phone calls to people in power. This is a stop everything moment. This must be a fall of fury, an autumn of organizing. As refusefascism.org said in our call for people to get in the streets and join the protests, no more ceding ground to fascists, no more surrendering the fundamental right to an abortion, no more waiting for the courts that are overrun with fascists to intervene, no more relying on the Democratic Party, which has conceded to and conciliated with Christian fascists as access to abortion got chipped away. This is the time to stay in the streets, using our power of sustained, nonviolent protest to stop the fascist assault on abortion and declare, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Get your laws and vigilantes off our bodies. Abortion on demand and without apology. So please let us know about your plans for continued action in the streets. DM us on social media at Refuse Fascism or email info@refusefascism.org. The need for determined, sustained mobilization to stop fascism was brought home powerfully recently when the University of Chicago Project of Security and Threats released their in-depth findings that 47 million people in the U.S. believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, and 21 million believe that violence would be justified to restore Trump to power. The same day those findings were released, Robert Kagan published a provocative opinion article titled, "Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here," in the Washington Post, which gets quite a few things wrong, but gets at something very real here. Quote, "With the party firmly under his thumb, Trump is now fighting the Biden administration on separate fronts. One is normal, legitimate political competition, where Republicans criticize Biden's policies, feed and fight the culture wars, and in general, behave like a typical hostile opposition. The other front is outside the bounds of constitutional and democratic competition, and into the realm of illegal or extra-legal efforts to undermine the electoral process. The two are intimately related, because the Republican Party has used its institutional power in the political sphere to shield Trump and his followers from the consequences of their illegal and extra-legal activities in the lead-up to January 6th. Thus, Representatives Kevin McCarthy and Elise Stefanik, in their roles as party leaders, run interference for the Trump movement in the sphere of legitimate politics, while Republicans in lesser positions cheer on the Jan 6 perpetrators, turning them into martyrs and heroes and encouraging illegal acts in the future, end quote. To be blunt, there is nothing, quote unquote, typical even about the most legitimate fronting Republifascists. There is nothing normal when you've got a fully fascist Supreme Court and when you can unleash raving mobs with an offhand comment, a wink, and a nod. But it's true that these fascists are making immense progress towards being able to walk right into power, even as they prepare to seize it by force. On the other hand, I think it's extremely important to contextualize the conversation you're about to listen to with the fact that tens of thousands have marched in the streets of Rio de Janeiro yet again just yesterday, demanding the ouster of fascist Bolsonaro, and that abortion rights have been successfully won and defended, even if in limited ways, around the world in recent years, when people have firmly planted themselves in the streets, demanding them. Now, here's my conversation with Rafia Zakaria.
So on this show, we think we need a flourishing of dissent and radical voices to defeat fascism, not lockstep unity behind the quote-unquote lesser evil of the neoliberal status quo. And today, I'm excited to talk with Rafia Zakaria. Rafia is an attorney and political philosopher. She is the author of a few beautiful books, Veil, The Upstairs Wife, An Intimate History of Pakistan, and the topic of today's show, Against White Feminism, which came out this year. She's also a columnist for Dawn in Pakistan, and she's written for The Guardian, Boston Review, The New York Republic, and The New York Times Book Review. Rafia, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on, Samantha. Thank you so much.
So I want to start out by really expressing real appreciation for you writing about and speaking about the war in Afghanistan and including it in your book. I know that there was a lot that you were covering, and I think it was really important that so much attention was played to speaking out against the war on Afghanistan and the drone war against Pakistan. And while your new book details the support for the war from various ostensibly progressive individuals and feminist groups, I want us to set the stage by talking about the basics. Can you talk about what the war has meant for the people in these countries, including women? If you could speak to that some, I think that's a good place to start.
Those of us who opposed the U.S. occupation and intervention for 20 years in Afghanistan, among the peace community, for instance, this debate has continued over the decades in the sense that trying to publicize, for instance, the 250,000 people dead in Afghanistan. And just avalanche of complete societal and familial disintegration that is Afghanistan today. And I guess even before this book, long before it, I had been writing about the presence in Afghanistan. And I had been writing about how Afghan women had become essentially political pawns that were being played both by the United States and then, of course, now by the Taliban. On one hand, they had the choice to buy into the promises of the U.S. occupation forces. I'm saying this obviously from speaking to Afghan women and others who are on the ground. It was always an uphill battle to try to get this issue of Afghan women and how they've been used into the conversation within the United States, because the decision to go to war was made. All sorts of people lauded it at the time. And then by and large, Afghanistan was forgotten about as the U.S. went about invading Iraq. The way American feminism, particularly white feminism, became embroiled in this war that was allegedly for the sake of Afghan women is a story really that begins in the late 90s. So in the late 90s, Mavis Leno, the wife of Jay Leno, the one-time late-night host, she held a fundraiser at her Hollywood home for Feminist Majority. And at the time, Feminist Majority was running a program to end gender apartheid in Afghanistan. So that's when this sort of became popularized and became kind of part of the celebrity savior complex that we have. Then, of course, 9/11 happened. And in in the immediate months after 9/11, Bush administration, which was looking for a moral reason or a moral gloss, they had to invade some country, right? They decided, after the 9/11 tragedy and how big it was and how angry everyone was, there was this sort of political pressure for immediate visible shock and awe type retaliation. And so the feminist majority actually consulted with the Bush administration on how this women's issue could be used. Essentially, it was a strategic war that the U.S. wanted to show that, it couldn't attack Saudi Arabia because of the danger to the U.S. oil supply. So Afghanistan was it, even though none of the hijackers were Afghan. And the idea was that, Al-Qaeda has allegedly found refuge there. So when this announcement for the war in Afghanistan is made by Colin Powell, leaders of the feminist majority were actually present, literally present in the room when the announcement was made. And there was almost like what I describe as a signing off of feminism, like here it is. Now you can do your dirty deed and I'll call it feminism. But that's exactly what happened. And for the years that went on after that, this idea that the U.S. was staying in Afghanistan to protect Afghan women was the sort of moral narrative of this war. And that remained the moral narrative even until now. Obviously, absolute erasure of the fact that in rural Afghanistan, especially women and men, there were funerals that were bombed. There were wedding celebrations that were bombed. There were men taken off for indefinite detention at Bagram. Family structure just sort of disintegrating because the men had died and the widows didn't know how to support themselves. So all of this was happening, but the front for it was, oh, look, Afghanistan has a skateboarding team. Oh, look, Afghan girls are doing robotics, which, they're not bad in themselves. And I'm glad that I guess some Afghan women got something out of it, but it was largely artificial. It was created and held up by US aid money. And obviously now, as soon as that money has been pulled out, that entire aid economy, along with the alleged progress that the US government vowed Afghan women had made, is gone in an instance.
Thank you, Rafia, for walking us through that. As someone who had been very anti-war and active at that time, there were some things I knew about the active role that so-called feminists played in facilitating the bombing. But there was a lot that I didn't know that was in your book. And so I think it's really important thinking about the real damage and carnage. There's all the bombings and the violence. And then there's the fact that 5 million Afghan people were forced from their homes by this war. It really is sickening. I just think that that's important to have in our minds and our understanding.
The first thing I wanted to add was, as someone who had been in peace movement and which carried out for years campaign against drones in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think you're aware of just how hard it was to make anybody in the US care at all about the use of drones to bomb people in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And to me, that memory is very, very clear. And then, of course, just like that, US was done with it and flung it off and went on to the next thing. And of course, Afghans are left to sort of pick up the detritus that we've left behind. The other thing I'm saying is that, there is a way to look at this sort of war debacle as the international iteration of a kind of authoritarian bent within American or white feminism, right? Which is that in the 80s and 90s, white feminists like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin were front and center trying to get the Violence Against Women Act passed. And the whole premise of the act was, we want the state to protect us from bad men. It broke so distinctly along racial lines in that's what white women were saying. They wanted this clause in the legislation that said that every time the police go to someone's house for a domestic violence call, someone has to be arrested. Now, Black and brown women absolutely did not agree. They raised so many objections and told the white feminists who were kind of pushing for the act that, look, this is not good. It's going to cause our men, like Black and brown men, to be arrested at far higher rates than white men. The idea of the state was as like this benevolent force that was going to protect women now from bad men. And of course, what the brown and Black feminists had said is exactly what happened. And, within a year, Black men and Hispanic men were arrested at 5 times the rate as white men, which obviously meant that this contributed to mass incarceration. And the worst thing was that it actually reduced the ability of brown and Black women to ask for help, because now they were afraid that their husbands, boyfriends, whatever, would be put in prison. And then that was going to sever the family. It ended up that there were huge increases actually in the rate of violence against Black and brown women following the act. But all this to say, this idea that the state will protect us from bad men, which, within the domestic context, basically meant Black men, right? It was like euphemism almost, given the arrest rates. And then 2001, the same formula, again, championed by white women, was applied to foreign policy, in that this amazing, awesome, cuddly white government of ours is going to protect us from terrorists, is going to protect us from brown men. And I do think that the title of your podcast and the sort of discussions you're having lend themselves to thinking about these issues in this way, so that the sort of pro-authoritarian bent of feminism is also exposed.
I really think that what you're sharing is essential for us to keep in mind. I think that the parallel when I was reading your book was one of the things that stood out to me. And I was like, yes, this is it. And I had no idea about that act or what it led to at all before reading your book. So it was really important parallel, but it was also a really important history lesson for me. And I think that one of the things that it reminded me of was that this system and its armed forces and its police forces can't be relied on to dismantle patriarchy or white supremacy. And in my opinion, not the opinion of everybody who produces the show, let alone all our listeners, to me, this is part of why we have to dismantle those systems so that we can dismantle the patriarchy and the white supremacy that are totally bound up with it. I wanted to get into another aspect that was in your book around the military and women. One of the things that I thought that was really sharp in your book was that white feminism, what I think of as imperialist feminism in Afghanistan, not only being a justification, but that the Taliban and other forces there that were oppressive were born out of imperialism and the occupation's progress, whatever degree that it did exist, which was very limited and has always been over-exaggerated, especially as it relates to education, was never going to be self-sustaining. And then in your book, you get into one of the most interesting things as it relates to this was it jumped out to me the way that the women's role in the US military and our supposedly superior status throughout the society has been used to justify American chauvinism and the wars, especially the glorification of women participating in torture and combat, and women being held up as quote unquote just as capable as the boys. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on that.
I think one of the important things about this alignment of the strong woman as someone who fights the war on terror, it's a particular note because it's still operative, right? What the kind of, a cultural product in a sense of 2 decades of fighting a Muslim country, Muslim countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, has been this creation of this emergent heroine as the white woman who is sort of beating and torturing the bad brown men. And, you saw this very, very kind of boldly portrayed in the film Zero Dark 30, which is about, I guess, Jessica Chastain's character in that movie is the woman, the CIA analyst who essentially finds bin Laden. And the entire crux of the movie, and I talk in the book, of course, about watching this movie for the first time and how disturbing it was to see the strong woman essentially presented as this white woman who is capable of torture. The first thing that's said about her in the movie is some guy goes, she's a killer. And what it does in even socio-cultural terms is paint the feminist as someone that is entirely on board with the U.S. interests in the war on terror, including torturing and killing people. And it's a very sort of sneaky way to do it, as Hollywood does. But its consequences are terrible, because essentially what is being told to white women is that, okay, well, maybe we'll let you have a bit of power. That's the white male message to them. Maybe we'll let you have a bit of power, but this is what's required. So you essentially have to become a torturer and a killer for you to be considered strong enough to not be marginalized anymore. And that's what gender equality is about. I mean, God, it's such a perverse thing when you think about it, is that gender equality reduced to your capability to be as heinous and murderous as white male soldiers or white male CIA agents. But of course, it wasn't just the movie. It's not just the character. I talk in the book about white women who kind of went marching off into Afghanistan to be reporters and photographers, and how much they've been feted over the years, despite the fact that they were very much part and parcel of creating the narrative that erased Afghan women when they were victimized by the US presence and highlighted the Afghan women that somehow benefited from it. That was part of it. I mean, I talk, for instance, about the Pulitzer Prize winning photographer Lindsay Addario, who's been celebrated so much for her pictures taken in Afghanistan. So much so, and this should be an example of the mental inertia that is so prevalent among the US sort of elite or just even US discourse, is that this woman went into a secret school operated by people who were resisting the Taliban. And she was told not to bring a camera, but she sneaks in a camera anyway. And then she takes pictures of the girl who are in the secret school. And those pictures are then published in the New York Times to much acclaim. And nobody bothers to consider the fact that these were girls who were going to school in hiding, whose picture has now been published in one of the largest newspapers in the world. Nobody thinks of that. Even now, nobody thinks of that. And I think that that is a good sort of analogy for the state of the war, of how people were erased, and how dehumanized the Afghan is in the American imagination.
It is extremely frightening to think about when you consider what the consequences likely were for those girls.
Right. And nobody bothers, even with that. Like, what happened? Who cares? Right? Because you got the picture, you did your thing, and now, whatever, they'll figure it out. That's the attitude. That's very much the attitude.
It's incredibly sobering. And just thinking, as you were speaking about how you said earlier that, people in this country for over a decade, the war went on for 20 years, at least for over a decade. I'll give people some credit, maybe. People didn't think about the war. People didn't think about the people who are being bombed, who were becoming refugees, who are experiencing all this violence at the hands of this government. And then the end of the war, the US official exit, it enters the map and the dialogue again. And then within, I think it may be, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I think it maybe was in the news, women in Afghanistan, maybe 2 weeks, where people were actively talking about women again and not being used to then justify people staying, not to question what the US was doing there in the first place, or that they were an utter failure by their own metrics. So it was very frustrating to me.
One of the worst parts of it, the one of the most depressing parts of it, was that you think, okay, so now America didn't know anything about Islam or Muslims, and then it went on this 2-decade rampage across the Muslim world and made Muslims the most suspect people in modern history. And maybe, hopefully, maybe it might have learned a few things about these countries or about Muslim culture or life. But, oh, no, sir, no can do. As soon as Afghanistan comes back into the picture, it's the same old, tired 20-year-old misconceptions and stereotypes that are immediately circulated, like with absolutely no hesitation at all. So that Clarissa Ward goes into Kabul, and I heard an Afghan woman tell me this, is that Clarissa Ward, blonde and blue-eyed, goes into Kabul and she's like questioning the Taliban and putting on the abaya and putting on the burqa, and it's all such theater. And she said, she makes life difficult for me because nobody had said anything about wearing abaya or burqas. But here you go. One of the first people to do it is this American reporter who's then interviewed by Terry Gross, again, as just such a heroine who really just went there. And it's sickening how much the disposable Afghan lives or cultural consideration is to white women who are trying to very opportunistically further their careers. It's not one white woman, she's a visible one, but there's so many who did that with the Afghan war, who were involved with the aid agencies, who were involved in sort of creating this fake aid economy in Afghanistan. And like there was a whole, for instance, mini industry of older white women going there, then starting a beauty salon or talking to a bookseller or whatever. And they got a whole little literature that evolved that was, very much white feminist savior lit. And so, but of course, nobody cared. After 20 years, Carolyn Maloney, who did the theatrics of wearing the burqa and talking about how oppressive it was in 2001, when the invasion was going to happen, what did she do? She put on a burqa to go to the Mecca. And so it was so centered around what America or what this white Western hegemon wants. And there was a real lack of concern about, what is actually going to happen? What are these women going to have to do? Because they are going to have to pay the price of feminism being delegitimized because it was sent over on American bombs.
I think that last point, people really need to take that to heart in a totally different perspective than what most journalists were projecting out into the world. I really found a lot of value in, and I know other listeners have written to me about it, was Anand Gopal's piece, The Other Afghan Woman.
Yes, that was fabulous.
And I really encourage people, if they have not read it, it's going to be in the show notes for this as well. The New Yorker did a good thing by publishing it. He does, in my humble opinion, a beautiful job of bringing the voices of the women in the countryside, which people should know that is the majority of women in Afghanistan, and bringing their stories alive and making people really see them and feel their experience, unlike what they got from a lot of the journalism that people were consuming. I wanted to shift gears a little bit. This is a Refuse Fascism podcast, and we talk a lot about the nature, the roots and trajectory of fascism in this country. And on this show, we do our best to put humanity first, not America first. And we know that fascism is rising around the world, and that it's not an insult, it's a qualitative change in how society is governed. That fascism's defining feature is the essential elimination of the rule of law and democratic and civil rights. One thing that we hammer a lot on is that there's this triad of fascism: misogyny, racism, white supremacy, and xenophobia. And I was wondering if you could speak to how you see this triad right now in the US being violently reasserted, this white supremacy, xenophobia, and male supremacy in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, my book is deeply connected to that triad in that the goal is to, when I set about writing it, my whole premise was that I wanted to expose in very specific terms how white supremacy, because it's been such a part of American history, that it has, of course, seeped into the feminist movement as well. There's a reason why the biggest feminist fight that we believe happened in the whole world, that we claim happened, is the white feminists fighting for the vote. And even in that story, we ignore the fact that at the same time, brown feminists in India, for instance, were fighting and won against a huge colonial power. And there is this tendency to believe in things being great or being discovered only when they are discovered by white people. And in the feminist story, that appears again and again when you see white women who are heroicized despite the fact that they were completely racist. Susan B. Anthony is still on the dollar, and she is the woman who said, "I'll tear off my right arm before I support the vote for the Negro." She said that. There's no historical debate or question about it. She said it, and yet she continues to be this glorified figure in the story, in American history in general, but in feminist history especially. And so that connection of this very close collusion between white women who are considered, okay, well, better to share power with a white woman than with Black and brown people. And that sort of continues right now, where white women, surveys have shown, there's a Deloitte survey, showed they're the racial group and gender group that's expanding its power faster than any other group in its presence on Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 boards. And so you have their sort of lean in, ruthless, sort of individualistic and very hierarchical model of feminism continuing to be ascendant. It is definitely the feminism that is lauded in mainstream American discourse and culture. And there is no attention paid to the fact that the individual careerist rises of these white women have, in most cases, happened at the expense of women of color. And so I definitely see that connection. And I see a very fascist impulse even now, even in the response to the book, where I'm again and again told, oh, well, this is divisive. And so the effort is that feminism, qua feminism, should never be recognized in its current form as white feminism. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that this group has been dominant. It has used its power to become the feminist archetype. And for me, as a brown feminist or other Black, Asian feminists, we shouldn't be required to become white to be really considered feminist. But that's where we are now. And the consequence of that is that there are very few, for instance, Muslim feminists or even brown or Black feminists that are really even interested in feminism as a movement as a whole. They all have started to just concentrate on their own sort of movements because they have seen the intransigence of institutions, white institutions that are completely unwilling to change the way they operate, to be accountable for racial inequality and the exploitation of brown and Black labor. In a sense, you could even consider the book as a last-ditch attempt at resuscitating feminism as a political movement instead of feminism as a brand, which is what it is now. It's a brand. It's how you sell this or that tchotchke or sneakers or whatnot.
I am nodding my head. I'm not sure if Rafia can see me because of the way that Zoom is right now, but I am nodding my head. I muted myself so that her sound can be of better quality. But I think that that needs to be screamed and graffitied all over.
Right. But, you know, like there's a deeper sort of hopelessness in it, right? Because there's this idea that people actually really think that they can never be successful unless they're ruthless and individualistic. Women think that. In their heart of hearts, they think that. And they're not willing to consider that our investments in sisterhood can become the vehicles for our success. I think that that idea of sisterhood is much more vibrant and alive in communities of color who have had to go through suffering and have had to rely on each other. There you have it again, is that the sort of self-centeredness of white feminism also does a terrible disservice to white women in the sense that it keeps them from ever realizing or sort of really understanding the beauty and the intense sort of sense of emotional well-being that can come from actual sisterhood.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. I also think that it keeps us from getting free, that we're never really going to break these chains unless we're breaking all of them. And we're doing it in the interests of all our sisters. And we're doing it knowing that these systems of oppression are totally intertwined and there is a common source. And to me, it's the system of capitalism. And unless people are willing to question the institutions that are taming their resistance, then we're not going to get free. And unless we're willing to question ourselves, those that we look up to, it's keeping us from getting free. And I think that at this moment, our freedom is getting rapidly smaller and smaller. Theocracy is rising around the globe. And fascism, the threat of it is a real and present danger. And what's required is real radical ruptures. We're going to go one way or another. It's either going to be a big change of people showing tremendous real solidarity and true empowerment. And we're going to see something vibrant and new and something we haven't seen before, or we're going down a path of something that's really frightening, that isn't just regressive, but a qualitative leap in oppression that we haven't seen before. So I think that the stakes are tremendously high.
I mean, I completely agree with you. And in that, I do feel that we are at a pivotal moment right now where things can transform into situations that are much better, much more equitable, much more egalitarian, or there can be a huge devolution that I'm afraid to even imagine. But I mean, look at the instruments of those devolution. I mean, the other day I was looking, I think her name is Jennifer Rubin, and she's written this book about how it was white women that actually beat Trump. Everybody knows that it was Black women whose votes put Biden over the edge. But regardless, she's written this whole book about how great white women are, and, you know, they had their march. I mean, which is no problem. White women are great. Like, a ton of people I love as much as myself are white. But there is this refusal in it to sort of cede any space at all. And there's a hubris in it that I really worry about, you know, as this next election draws near and we have to sort of deal with our demons again. I mean, just the idea of anti-authoritarianism for millions of Americans right now is to not wear a mask and not get a vaccine. So, I mean, there's something very deep and dark wrong with us, that is the belief. And it just chills me to the bone. And really, I mean, you know, my book is about white feminism, but it's coming out within this context of a complete misappropriation of the language of resistance, complete and total misappropriation. And I think one of the important ways of resisting in general, like in the book, is to preserve that vocabulary and try to take it back from having been co-opted in the way it was in Afghanistan, in the way it was in reducing feminism to just what sort of harmonized with capitalism and taking out all the rest. I think that on the larger scale, that is also what needs to happen, is that we need to take vocabularies of resistance and revolution back from the powerful.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one closing question that I think connects a lot with what you were saying about resistance. And in this country, in the US, we are on the precipice of losing the right to abortion. It's basically gone in Texas. December 1st, the Supreme Court will hear it. They've already showed their hand of how they're going to play it based in the way that they sat out of Texas. And we know that the access to legal abortion matters. A lot of white feminists are telling people basically that we shouldn't be talking about women dying from abortion because it's a right-wing talking point and the abortion pill can be safe, right? Meanwhile, they're doing away with the pill and you have to have it accessible to get. We know that with the Hyde Amendment, it's very hard for Black and brown women to access abortion to begin with. And I'm wondering, given the fact that the stakes are so high, what do you think resistance needs to be in this country for people who care about pregnant people having the right to abortion?
I mean, I share your concerns, and those are my thoughts exactly. I feel that Texas is a consequence of complacency, though, on the part of the feminist movement, right? We've been talking now of like how this idea has been misused, but it's also true that even feminists like Gloria Steinem, who once were radicals, essentially signed off on the capitalist takeover of feminism and its reduction to sort of these careerist ideas. And more importantly, and most importantly, it's depoliticization in the sense that when the word empowerment was coined and brown feminists came up with it, it was envisioned as a political struggle, first and foremost. The idea that feminism could exist outside of political struggle and a demand for social and political transformation was just written out of the script completely. And so now, as feminists, we're in the US in 2021, I think we were sitting ducks because we don't really have a thriving political movement count on that could immediately have a political response, marches, sit-ins, etc., against Texas. We depleted that movement by getting into these wars, by saying, okay, well, my access to the C-suite is the number one agenda. And so, we kind of left all of that and we let it, the political grit that's necessary to truly protecting the gains you make. No woman anywhere in the world can protect any gains that are made, whether economic, social, legal, whatever, unless they have the political capacity to protect them. And we don't. And so the only way I see out of it is a recognition of that, is a recognition of the fact that our inability to have a political movement which demands that women make political choices to be feminist, where it's not just this sort of crazy idea of choice feminism where it's like everything I do is a feminist because I'm a woman. I'm sorry, but that's just bullshit. Your choices have an impact on other women. And so, yes, you have to be accountable and answerable for your choices. I really see Texas as a symptom. I see it as this sort of complacency that infected the movement, and its radical aspects were all filed down and it was made pretty for capitalism. And then, you could wear like a tutu and have nice heels and you're a feminist. That's what happens. Texas is what happens when you reduce it to that, because the other side comes to play too. And they're not going to let your moment of weakness or disorganization, they're not going to just let it pass. And, I think that the challenge is formidable, but my hope is that the sheer aggression of the challenge that we face post-Texas will wake up future and existing generations of feminism to the necessity of having political teeth and making choices that are cognizant of their political and material implications on others. So that's my hope. And I feel that the conversation on race is integral if we're going to have that kind of feminism. Because as long as we're afraid to talk about it and we impose this sort of gag rule on women of color where they can't, demand accountability from white feminists who have had more power, we're never going to get to that political movement. But the time is now. Everything is changing. Every single thing about our lives is being transformed in some way or another. And, I take hope in the fact that, look, I'm a brown Muslim woman. And the fact that I could even write a book like this, it's tremendous. And it does reflect an opening that hasn't existed before. But that would be utterly eliminated if we're not vigilant in the right now.
Thank you, Rafia, for joining us and having this important conversation. I appreciate your perspective, your honesty, and the fact that in your book, you don't hold back. Everyone can find a link to Against White Feminism, Rafia's latest book, in the show notes. And Rafia, can you tell listeners how you would like them to follow you? Do you have a website you want them to go to? Do you want them to reach out to you on Twitter? What's the best way?
Yeah, I would love for you guys to reach out to me on any social media platform. I'm Rafia Zakaria, one word, on Twitter. And I'm Rafia Zakaria Feminist, one word, on Instagram. I guess I also have a Facebook page. But yeah, I mean, it's not hard to get a hold of me, and I welcome engagement. It's what keeps my thinking alive and is very enriching and nourishing for me. So I look forward to hearing from you guys.
For more on the roots of the U.S. war for empire in Afghanistan, I recommend you listen to episode 76 with Nazia Kazi, episode 74 with Khaled Bedoun, and episode 73 with Matthew Ho. I learned from and find a lot of unity in what Rafia brings forward in her book, and I really loved our conversation and look forward to continued collaboration. I do have disagreements, of course, which I do with almost all my guests, to be frank. To that end, I want to share an excerpt of an essay by Nai Zunai that I find clarifying and essential. I should note, this is not the opinion of everyone who produces the show or is part of Refuse Fascism, but I think you'll find it thought-provoking. Quote, forms of oppression, quote-unquote, intersect, for they occur in the context of a worldwide system of capitalism imperialism. But proceeding from this quote-unquote standpoint or quote-unquote narratives of even the most oppressed does not get to the underlying system and how all these oppressive social relations are interwoven in the history of the society and the nature of the system. They go on to say, without science and a scientific approach to get at the root causes, what is needed to uproot this and set up a radically different system and society, all resistance and struggles are channeled back into the very same system that is the source of this oppression in the first place. Without this, even the sincerest and best of intent, insight, analysis, and struggle is constrained or straitjacketed by the fundamental lack of seeing beyond the capitalist mode of production, the permanence of this system. The narratives and lived experiences of the oppressed, silenced for too long, have a critical role, but in this context, to make revolution and to get beyond it all for the emancipation of all of humanity, not to, quote-unquote, get mine or get atop a quote-unquote woke world. And that's the end of that excerpt. With that said, go read Rafia's book, Against White Feminism, and connect with Rafia. Thank you for listening to Refuse Fascism. To everyone who was out in the streets rallying for abortion rights yesterday, please tag @Refuse Fascism in any social media pics and video that you didn't upload yet. And let us know about your thoughts on the day. I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, ideas for topics or guests, or lend a skill. Tweet me @SamB Goldman. Or you can drop me a line at SamanthaGoldman@refusefascism.org, or leave a voicemail by calling 917-426-7582. You can also record a voice message by going to anchor.fm/refuse-fascism and clicking the button there. You might even hear yourself on a future episode. Want to support the show? It's simple. Show us some love by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. And subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you want to help us reach more listeners, donate to help us place podcast ads. Give at refusefascism.org or Venmo, refuse-fascism. Thanks to Lena Thorne, Richie Marini, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each episode, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox each week. We'll be back next Sunday with an episode that features an interview with our friend and comedian, Walter Masterson. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.